All right. Thanks, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Ian Frist. I'm the Cybersecurity Compliance Program Director at Corning. Like Tim said, I'm pretty good at passing tests, so I have a few certifications. Most recently, I've been really involved in CMMC, so I do a lot of our DIB work as well at Corning. If anybody wants to fall down in that rabbit hole after the presentation, feel free to find me. But today, my role at Corning is the Cybersecurity Compliance Director. I don't oversee day-to-day OT type operations, so what am I doing here? Well, I'm here because more and more regulations are starting to take ICS into account. It's no longer just the energy sector that is being regulated. It's no longer just the energy sector that is seeing their manufacturing, their ICS systems being, regulated and being inspected and audited. We're seeing that come into the manufacturing systems as well. Standards like CMMC, like FDA, all kinds of standards out there now take a look at ICS. Not as heavily as like NERC does in energy, but they are starting to notice this side of the house. And also because the leadership at these companies, they have other motivators, right? They're starting to see the risk that their companies face. That's a good thing, right? But they're starting to understand the risk that they face, the threats that they face. They understand that these manufacturing systems are what makes our money, right? These are how we make the widgets that we sell that make our revenue. So they've started to understand that we need to protect these systems and that these systems need a different type of protection. So these leaders have gone to their boards, they've gone to their companies, and they've secured funding, right? And then those leaders go off and they go shopping, right? Which is great. They take a look, they go shopping for security solutions. And if you do a very quick search, you'll be bombarded with buzzwords, right? You'll see things like artificial intelligence and blockchain, zero trust, pen testing, flux capacitors, encabulators. Pick your poison, right? There's all kinds of options out there to help you better secure your ICS OT environment. It can be very daunting for a new security leader or someone that's just getting into the ICS OT space that's used to securing an IT enterprise to take a look at. And the majority of those solutions, they don't tell you they're going to solve part of the problem, right? A lot of them will tell you they'll manage everything from asset inventory all the way to network monitoring and everything in between. So again, it's just a daunting search when you're finally taking over, that look at that program. And before the vendors run me out of the room, I'm not saying that these tools aren't important and they aren't effective. We have a room full of vendors that are offering phenomenal products next door. These technologies are great. And although I'm calling them buzzwords, I think we know that zero trust has a place in the environment. It can be effective. So can all of these other technologies and all of these other, new tools that are out there. I'm not saying they're ineffective. I'm not saying you shouldn't purchase them, right? They are great. They are effective, but they do have a place, right? Maturity matters. There is a time and a place to go and purchase these tools. I'm gonna use a reference. I was climbing this weekend, so I'll use a mountain reference, right? Security is a journey. If you're gonna go climb Mount Everest, you should probably start somewhere small, right? Maybe learn how to tie knots on a rope or buy some gear. If you just up and pay for a guide and go climb Mount Everest, you may get lucky, right? You might get to the top and get lucky enough to get back down, but more than likely, you're not going to make it all the way up. You're going to have issues and you're going to fail in your endeavor. So security is kind of the same way. It's a journey when we're building these programs. And that maturity journey requires that you have fundamental pieces in place. Back to the mountain analogy, you've got to have those rope skills and the right equipment and all of those things in place before you can start and go on to bigger and better things in security. Just like a house, you can't build a security program without getting a solid foundation. You really have to have that solid foundation in place before you move forward with the rest of your security program. I want to implement, or I really want to hit on too, that these aren't controls that I'm about to come and tell you about. These are foundational efforts. I don't like to see them as parts of a framework or as a specific control, because I think they're simpler than that. These are the basics that you need to have covered before you can go down that framework journey or make an effective tool. This room full of vendors that we have next door, all of these tools that they're selling, they're only more effective if you do the foundations first. And a lot of times, if you don't have foundational controls in place, the tools aren't as effective as you would like them to be. And that's going to cause a surprise later on. So what do I see as foundational controls in manufacturing? And again, I went with controls again, right? These are efforts, right? Not controls, but really foundational efforts. And I see those as asset inventory, network diagrams, and data flow diagrams. I really see these as the key cornerstones that you have to have in place before you can go out and build a more effective cybersecurity program. So let's start at the top. Why did I start with asset inventory? Well, it's CIS control number one, right? I mean, and the way the CIS controls work, that means that you have to start there first before you go to anything else. There's a reason for that. You do need to know what you're protecting. I think especially in manufacturing, where we're not talking about these large, diverse, geographical locations. We're talking about a building where things get added and taken away all the time. Having an effective asset inventory is really important. And that inventory needs to cover all levels of the Purdue model. Don't leave anything out. And also don't forget your air gap devices or, high latency. I can't claim credit for that. I saw that on LinkedIn and I couldn't find who posted it. So I stole that, but I really like it, right? We know air gaps aren't real. It's just high latency. Somehow data crosses that air gap. So those have to be part of your asset inventory as well. Next, network diagrams. So if you think of your asset inventory as the pieces, right? Your network diagram is the map of possible routes between those pieces. That helps you build that true understanding of your environment. And again, they should show all levels of the Purdue model. They should show the air gap connections, right? There is some connection there. You get updates to that system somehow. You get data to that system somehow. So draw that into your network diagrams. Build the map of possible connections. With the network diagram, you're not building how the data may actually flow, right? You're building how it could flow. And I think that's really important. So you take the pieces, then you build the map, and then you incorporate the data. So now you're going to show how data flows across the environment, right? So you have the pieces, you have the map, and then how data actually goes across that map is really important. And again, I keep hitting on this, but all three of these controls are only effective if you do them across your entire environment. If you find ways to have exceptions, I'm not going to put this camera on, or I'm not going to put this RTU on, or this drive, or this oven, right? Then you're going to find more and more exceptions, and you're not going to solve the problem. So it's very important to have this cross all levels of that Purdue model, from the bottom all the way to the top. And it's also really important to show the air gap. So with data flows, you want to show how that data actually jumps that air gap, right? Is it sneaker net? That's what we typically see in manufacturing, but show that line, show that flow, and explain it within these diagrams. And again, these are foundational efforts. I really think that you have to start here before you look at other controls. I think this comes before segmentation, because if you don't do this first, how do you know what to segment, right? What do you can't draw those lines because you don't know how data even flows. What you're going to end up doing is putting firewalls in place, doing segmentation, and you're probably going to leave them a lot more porous than you wanted to because you don't understand the data flows across there. You may not start with that denial at the top because you're worried about blocking traffic you don't know about. If you don't go on this discovery first, it's really hard to effectively segment an environment. All right, so that sounds great, right? But how do we accomplish this, right? In Greenfield, it's easy. It's easy in Greenfield, or it should be easy in Greenfield, to build this from the ground up. It's easy to build an inventory of the assets you're bringing in. It's easy to draw these maps because you're going to have them all ready to go when you're putting it together, right? It's easy to build those data flows because you're imagining them as you go. You know what systems are going to talk to each other, but that's not manufacturing. We do Greenfield environments sometimes, but the vast majority of manufacturing environments, they've been making whatever widget they're making for decades, right? They're in these established buildings that have been running for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, sometimes longer, sometimes a lot longer. The systems integrator, they came in 30 years ago and put that system in. The last guy that knew the password to some of those things left the company 20 years ago and is enjoying their pension, right? We see that a lot in manufacturing. So how do we go into these environments, which is what we're really worried about, right? And add these controls with your boots on the ground. Guys, if there's one thing you take from this presentation, it's that ICS OT cybersecurity is not a spectator sport, right? Remote work's great. I work remote. I know a lot of people in the room work remote, but don't let that stop you from traveling and seeing these sites. You have to get on the ground. You have to get your team on the ground to understand what you're actually making and how you're making it. That context is so important to building an effective manufacturing cybersecurity program, right? When you're trying to build this from the ground up, if you don't understand that, you're never going to build a truly effective program. And it's not just you. Your team needs to go see it. These people that you hire to come in to help you, even if they've come from another manufacturing company, they probably weren't making the same thing. And if they were making the same thing, they weren't making it the same way, right? So it's incredibly important to get boots on the ground to really build an effective program. There's no security tool, I'll say this, and I know some may disagree, that will give you that 100% accurate asset inventory network diagram and data flow diagram. You just can't get that through just automation. You'll never know what you don't know. And one day, you know, maybe you're lucky, maybe you make it to the top of the mountain and you come back down and you have a great time and you have a great story. But if you're unlucky and you don't make it all the way up, one day you might be surprised by an incident that comes from a network segment that you didn't even know existed, because you didn't get your boots on the ground and you didn't go find it and you didn't go understand the processes. And a tool can't always tell you that, because a tool is not good at identifying the unknown unknowns, right? I'm probably going to trip up saying unknown unknowns a few times, but automated tools are only as good as the parameters we program them into them, right? They only go the places we point them to. We might give them a large swath of network segments to look at, but you know, there may be a router they can't cross. There may be an air gap that tool can't jump, or at least can't jump very quickly, right? So it's really important to understand that you can only make the tool do so much. It might get you 90% of the way there, or 95% of the way there, or even 99% of the way there, but it still can't get you all the way. It's very rare in manufacturing to not have some random air gap machine, to not have a CNC machine that sits in one corner of the plant and only runs on Tuesdays in March, on even years, right? Like that happens in manufacturing. So those unknown unknowns, the tool won't tell you about those. So how do you know what you don't know if you only ever rely on a tool that is following parameters that you plugged in? So you have to eliminate those unknown unknowns. And the only way to do that is to put boots on the ground and get hands-on, right? Walk around, touch devices, see what's happening, understand processes, and move forward with that kind of work. You can't rely on just the tool. And the problem is, if you don't build this, you know, if you don't eliminate those unknown unknowns early, that expensive tool you paid for is going to end up being ineffective, right? So that's not what we want either. When we go and we purchase these tools and we partner with these vendors and we implement these programs, we want them to be effective. And the only way we can be certain they're going to be effective is if we've eliminated the unknown unknowns. There we go. So, all right, great. Ian, I listened to you. You said put boots on ground. So here I am, I'm on site. What do I do now, right? I decided to dust things off, to go travel, and to go see my manufacturing. So what do I do? Well, the first thing I'm going to tell you to do is step back and decide how you want to attack this problem by building a repeatable process. So this is the compliance and auditor in me, right? And a lot of what I'm about to go through here on my process are things I've developed because I'm doing CMMC, preparatory audits, self-assessments, things like that, defining scope. These are all, you know, practices that are able to carry over because of the discovery processes, right? I use this same discovery process whether I'm doing a CMMC audit or if I'm going to go and try to figure out how to implement a new OT cybersecurity program. I think they work well together. So you have to build a repeatable process, and you have to build a repeatable process regardless of how many locations you have. Even if you only have one location, it's better to step back and define this process ahead of time so you have an idea of what you're going to do when you get there. And then if you do acquire another location, or if they're going to put a new system in, or if they put a new system in and didn't tell you, you know what you're going to do when you get there. So it's really important to build a process that you're going to follow time and time again to really assess these locations. But I'm going to help you with that. And the model I like to use when I'm building this process is people, data, systems, right? That's the mantra I repeat to myself when I'm on these sites and I'm trying to understand scope and I'm trying to understand how things work and what we do. My go-to approach at attacking people, data, systems starts with finding that person that understands that plant better than anybody else. There's always somebody, right? It might be the plant manager, it might be the IT site lead, it might be an engineering lead, you might find a salesperson or physical security. There is somebody that has worked at that plant since the beginning of time, and they understand all of the history, right? They understand what you're making, how you're making it, and how you got there. And that context is really important. So I identify that person first, and then I tell that person to go show me around. And while I'm on that tour, I'm focused on my 3 things, which are people, data, and systems. When I'm on this tour, I'd really like to flow with the product one way or the other. I like to do, all right, we have to make this product from start to finish and follow it all the way through. Sometimes you have to jump in the middle just because of how things are laid out, or that's how the tour flows. But for me, it's much simpler to start this from where a product comes into the company and then where it exits. You could follow it the other way too, but I found this to be the best approach. So people, what am I looking for? This is where I want to meet everybody that works there. I want to understand the roles. I want to understand the teams. I want to understand what they do to the product. I want to talk to everybody from the plant manager down to somebody that stocks the shelves or handles shipping and receiving at the bottom end, right? I want to understand every piece of that puzzle. What do they do? How do they do it? What systems do they use? What data do they touch? This will help me understand how products actually flow through the environment. So these tours usually take a long time. I spend a lot of time going through. I build a lot of time into these trips so that I can go and talk to these people and stop and have those conversations. Hey, tell me what you do, right? How do you do that? What data do you touch? What system do you put it in, right? But always start with the people. The people are the most important part. They're what actually makes this flow. And if you build those relationships with them and you bring that person from the plant that they all know because they've been there since the beginning of time, they're also going to be more relaxed and more willing to talk to you, right? You're not here as an auditor for this process. It's a discovery process. And then I focus on data. So what data do those people interact with, right? I want to know how they handle it, what they're doing with it, what type of data it is. I don't just care about digital, I care about paper too, because that paper was printed by some kind of IT asset, right? How do they get that paper data? What do they do with it when they're done with it? There's a lot of standards that talk about destroying things, right? Properly destroying paper data. What do they do with it, right? Where does it go? Why are we printing it? You know, how are we marking it? How are we tagging it? So I care about the paper and the digital data. But as I'm talking to these individuals, I'm going to work with them and understand what they touch, what they interact with, how that data moves, right? Because how that data moves is going to help me to understand my next step, which is systems. Do they use file shares? Do they use emails? Do they use thumb drives? Mobile devices? How do they jump that air gap, right? Do they plug a random Ethernet cable in once a month to pull data over? Do they walk something over with SneakerNet, right? So I need to understand what these people do with the data and how that data flows across the environment, because that'll start telling me what's in scope. Where do they print it? Where do they save it? Where do they share it? How do they get it from a customer? That's another important part, right? When the customer orders a piece or a part or a widget, how does that data come into the environment? And then how do they send it to the customer? What goes with it when they send it, right? How do they track that? These are all important parts of the process, and they're going to help you find, those buried systems that you didn't know about. Which brings me to systems. This falls in the line really easily once you've talked to all of the teams across the environment. So you talk to the teams, you understand the data, and then it's pretty easy to figure out the systems. Oh, they use regular domain joined endpoints with a bar scanner, right? And that's how they track something through the environment. And these SMB shares are in because we use file shares to track things, or emails in because that's how we communicate about it. So it's really easy once you've talked to the people, once you've understood the data they're touching, to then understand the systems that they use to accomplish that task. So once I've done these 3 things, it's a lot easier to draw my scope, to understand the flow, and to start building my foundational efforts. And one more thing on the touring, it's really important to jump in the rabbit holes and turn over the rocks. So again, like I said, when I go on site, I add a lot of time. Sometimes I don't use it all, but I always budget the time to have all those different conversations. If you encourage those conversations, even if you get a little off subject, right, you're going to build that confidence with someone, and they're going to tell you the things that you didn't otherwise think of. Ask questions. How do you do that, right? What do you interact with to do that thing? Hey, you haven't talked about that process before, or that cutting process. Where's that? So a lot of times where I'll ask that question, they're like, oh, well, there's this back room with this other CNC machine that we only use for that and only for this one batch a year, right? Then we go back on the tour and we go look at that back room we didn't know about. I've found things, where there's discrepancies in how paper gets destroyed or how digital evidence gets destroyed, right? Where does it get sent? What does it do? You'll find different answers across the environment. So take time to fall in those rabbit holes and pull on all those threads, build those relationships, and really work hard to interview everybody so that you get all the right answers. You don't want to do this 6 times at a site, right? Because then you'll start causing downtime and interrupting. You really want to get this right when you go and you visit and get this initial idea of how to get your arms around it. So wrapping everything up, and I am way early, it's a good thing that manufacturing companies are paying more attention to ICS and OT. And I said that at the get-go. It's really important that we are taking a look at securing these environments. I think it's crucial to us that we take and we put the appropriate protections in place. So I'm happy about that. But you've got to have the foundational efforts in place to build these programs. We can't just let leaders of manufacturing companies and security leaders go and buy just a buzzword and think that they're secure, right? We have to encourage manufacturing leaders to build effective security programs, not just buy a tool and a fire and forget and be done with it. It's really important that we build programs because it's much more effective and it'll be much better holistic security. So you can't do effective ICS OT security without that solid foundation up front. And finally, before you go out and spend a lot of capital and a lot of expense on a new expensive security solution, please take the time to go visit your sites, right? Take the time to go out, to see them, to dust off the travel card, and to go and understand the sites you're working with. Get that context, get your team involved, build those relationships so that you're better able to build a solid security program. And that's all I've got, unless there's questions.